What if the most dangerous man in the room isn't the loudest, isn't the strongest, isn't the one giving commands? What if it's the one who lost everything and still didn't curse God? That was Job. He didn't beg. He didn't fold. He didn't explain himself. He just endured. And that made him unstoppable. Not because he won a battle, but because he survived the silence. Because he stayed when most would have walked. Because he kept his posture when the world around him collapsed. This isn't just a sad story. This isn't just about suffering. It's a strategic blueprint for anyone who wants to hold spiritual position when everything else falls apart. Let's talk about Job. Let's talk about endurance. Let's talk about what makes a soul unshakable. When silence hurts the most. You may not be Job, but maybe you've been in his shoes. You prayed. Nothing changed. You stayed faithful and still lost. You cried, and heaven stayed quiet. That's the part no one prepares you for. When life collapses and God seems silent, but Job didn't walk away. He didn't curse. He didn't fold. He stayed. He endured. And that made him powerful, because true endurance isn't passive. It's spiritual resistance. It's saying, I don't understand, but I won't back down. In this video, we're not just talking about pain. We're unlocking the strategy inside it. You'll learn how to stay grounded when God is silent, why endurance is a form of spiritual warfare, and how Job's posture can become your power. Let's break it down. 1. The silence test. Faith, when heaven says nothing. Pain hurts, but silence? Silence makes you question everything. You can survive the storm if you hear God in the thunder. But what if the thunder stops? What if the one you trust the most goes quiet right when you need him the most? That's where Job stood. He didn't just lose his wealth. He didn't just bury his children. He didn't just scrape boils off his skin with broken pottery. He cried out, and heaven didn't answer. No vision, no dream, no whisper, just silence. That's a different kind of suffering. The kind that makes you stare at the sky and ask, where are you? Why me? Do you still see me? And still, nothing. But here's what most people miss. The silence wasn't empty. It was a test. Because it's easy to trust God when He's speaking, when prayers get answered, when presence is felt. But faith isn't proven when God feels close. Faith is forged when He feels far. The silence of God isn't proof of His absence. It's proof that He's watching, without intervening, to see what you'll do without applause. Will you still stand when He doesn't speak? Will you still believe when nothing makes sense? Satan thought he had Job cornered. He wasn't just watching for pain. He was waiting for one line, God failed me. Because the enemy doesn't need to kill you if he can get you to curse the one holding you. But Job didn't curse. He grieved. He tore his robe. He fell to the ground. And then he said, the Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. That's not denial. That's dominion. That's spiritual command presence in chaos. Job didn't pretend he was okay. He just refused to let the silence define his loyalty. He chose to worship without answers, and that kind of faith terrifies hell. Because when God is silent, the enemy speaks louder. He whispers lies into the gaps. You've been forgotten. This proves He's not real. You must have done something wrong. That's why silence is strategic. It doesn't just expose your faith, it exposes your foundation. It reveals what applause used to cover. It strips away comfort and shows what's real. And Job, what he had was real. Not because he had clarity, but because he had conviction. And that made him dangerous. But silence wasn't the only pressure. There was another voice. Not demonic, not distant, but devastating. His own wife looked him in the eyes and said, "Curse God and die." This next moment, it's not about pain, it's about power. Let's talk about what it takes to stay in position when even those closest to you tell you to quit. 2. No curse, no collapse, holding it together when everything falls apart. Sometimes the hardest voices aren't your enemies. They're the ones you love, the ones grieving with you, bleeding beside you, and still speaking death over your endurance. Job's wife wasn't a villain. She was broken. She watched everything disappear. Their wealth, their children, their future. So when she said, "Are you still holding on to your integrity? Curse God and die." It wasn't evil. It was exhausted. It was grief, unguarded. And that's what makes this moment dangerous. Because Satan didn't speak through a demon. He spoke through someone Job trusted. Not with a sword, but with a sentence. And Job? He didn't lash out. He didn't collapse. He didn't even defend himself. He simply said, "Shall we accept good from God and not trouble?" No dramatics, no victimhood, just quiet conviction, standing in ashes. That kind of calm and emotional fire, that's not natural. That's forged through years of trusting God. Not because life is good, but because God is. Let's pause here. Because people think strength is loud, that it yells, proves, posts, fights back. But the strongest man in the room might be the one who doesn't say what his pain is begging him to scream. That was Job's power. Not that he didn't hurt, but that he didn't hand his hurt a microphone. You ever been there? So angry, so tired, so ready to explode. And someone says, "Just let it out." But something in your spirit whispers, "Not like that." That whisper, that restraint, that's spiritual self-control. That's dominion under pressure. Because the enemy didn't need Job to die. He just needed him to curse, to say one thing that would forfeit everything. Because when pain controls your mouth, you give it access to your destiny. But Job? He held the line. And in doing so, he declared something hell couldn't handle. "You can touch everything I have, but you won't rewrite who I am." He didn't need to feel strong to be unbreakable. He just needed to stay grounded when everything else was falling apart. But here's the truth we often forget. Staying grounded doesn't mean you don't feel it. Doesn't mean you don't ache. Doesn't mean you don't wrestle at midnight between belief and heartbreak. So what do? When the grief won't leave, but the faith won't die? That's where Job shifts the battlefield. Not to silence, not to surrender, but to lament, holy, brutal, unfiltered lament, as an act of trust. Let's go there next. 3. The power of lament, when grief becomes worship. Some people think that faith means smiling through the storm, keeping it together, holding it in. They call it strong. But that's not what Job did, not even close. He didn't suppress his grief. He poured it out, loud, honest, unfiltered. He said things like, "Why was I ever born? I have no peace, no quietness, no rest, only turmoil." That's not polite. That's raw pain. But here's the key. He still said it to God. He didn't go silent. He didn't walk away. He didn't fake it. He grieved into the presence of God. That's lament. It's not the opposite of faith. It's one of its deepest expressions. Because when you keep talking to a God you don't understand, when you cry to Him, not just about Him, that's worship. That's what Job teaches us. You can scream, you can question, you can break down ... and still be faithful. Let's be real. Pain isolates. Suffering makes you feel like you failed spiritually, like you're doing something wrong because you're not strong enough. But maybe strength isn't silence. Maybe it's the courage to be fully human. in front of a holy God. And God? He can handle your ache. He can hold your questions. He's not offended by your tears. In fact, he might be more present in your tears than he ever was in your applause. Job lost everything and still brought his pain to the altar. That's why his faith was unshakable, not because it was always pretty, but because it was always real. But even after the grief, even after the silence and the tears, Job wasn't done being tested. Now came a different kind of pressure. Not physical, not emotional, but relational. His friends showed up, and instead of comforting him, they started pointing fingers. And in that moment, Job had a choice. Would he let their voices define his worth, or would he hold the frame? Let's talk about how Job kept his posture when people closest to him tried to tear it down. Fourth, hold the frame when you're misunderstood but still standing. Pain is one thing. Being misunderstood while you're in pain, that's another level. Job had already lost everything: his body, his children, his wealth, and just when he could have used a little grace, his friends showed up and started explaining his pain like they had it all figured out. Maybe you sinned, Job. God is just, this must be judgment. You must have done something to deserve this. It's wild how people will see your suffering and assume it's your fault. Like pain only makes sense if someone can blame it. And let's be honest, that still happens today. You go through something hard, a breakup, burnout, loss, and suddenly everyone's an expert on your spiritual life. They say, maybe God's teaching you a lesson. Maybe you didn't pray enough. Maybe this is karma. That stuff cuts deep because it doesn't just attack your heart, it attacks your integrity. But Job, he didn't flinch. He didn't fold. He listened. He wept. But he didn't let their opinions change his posture. He held the frame. That means he didn't try to prove anything. He didn't need to convince them he was righteous. He didn't hand over his story for them to edit. He stayed rooted in what he knew. I've done nothing wrong. And even if I never understand this, I'm not turning my back on God. That's a different kind of strength. It's quiet, it's not flashy, but it's powerful. Because when you're at your lowest and people start projecting their own fears and theology onto you, you have one job: stay planted. Stay clear. Don't explain what God hasn't told you to explain. Sometimes the most spiritual thing you can do is not react, not defend, and just keep trusting. But even after you've stayed silent, even after you've stayed grounded, there's still the waiting. Not hours, not days, sometimes years. And there's no update, no sign, no shift. So what do you do when you've done everything right and still nothing changes? That's where real endurance begins. Let's talk about what it means to wait without bitterness. 5. Sacred endurance when staying feels like losing. Let's talk about the part nobody likes: waiting. Not waiting for a bus, not waiting for an answer. Waiting for God to move, to show up, to say something, to do anything. That's where Job was. He didn't know how long it would last. He didn't know if things would ever get better. He had no timeline, no closure, no hint of breakthrough. Just another day of pain. And he stayed. That's endurance. Not the kind that shows up on stage. Not the kind that gets celebrated in sermons, but the kind that happens in silence, in private, in uncertainty. And here's the truth. Endurance doesn't feel holy when you're in it. It feels like delay. It feels like being forgotten. It feels like punishment. But Job kept showing up, not because he felt strong, but because he refused to give his pain the final word. He said, "Though he slay me, yet will I trust him." That line isn't poetic. It's warfare. Because when you stay rooted in a season you don't understand, you're not being passive. You're taking ground in the spirit. Hell hates endurance because it means you can't be manipulated by circumstances. You're not controlled by outcomes. You're loyal even without results. That's spiritual power, and it terrifies the enemy. So if you're in a season of long silence, of no answers, of I'm still here but I don't know why, here's what I need you to hear. Do not make permanent decisions from temporary pain. Don't run from what God hasn't released you from. Don't move just because it hurts to stay. Some of the deepest influence is built, not through speed, but through staying power. And then, when Job had nothing left to prove, no strength left to flex, and no reason left to wait, that's when it happened. God showed up, not just to restore Job, but to reverse everything the enemy meant to destroy. Let's talk about that divine reversal. 6. Divine reversal, the breakthrough you didn't beg for. After all the loss, after all the silence, after the accusations, the grief, the waiting, God shows up, but not to apologize, not to explain, not to give Job a detailed breakdown of why it all happened. He simply speaks with power, with presence, with the kind of voice that reminds you, I was here the whole time. And what comes next is what most people remember: the restoration, double what was lost, family, wealth, long life, honor, in place of humiliation. But don't miss this. God didn't reverse Job's story because Job demanded it. God reversed it because Job didn't walk away. He didn't worship to be rewarded. He didn't endure for the payout. He stayed because his loyalty wasn't based on outcome. It was built on who God is. That's what divine reversal responds to. Not performance, not perfection, but persistence. Sometimes the win isn't in the miracle. It's in the man who refused to let go of his frame, even when it looked like God was gone. And here's the application. You don't have to know when it will change. You just have to hold your ground until heaven decides it's time. Every morning, even when you feel weak, whisper this to yourself: I'm still standing, and that's already power. Because the enemy didn't get what he came for. He came for your confession. He came for your surrender. He came to see you curse God and quit. But you didn't. You stayed. You endured. And that means the reversal is already set in motion. So what does this all mean for you right now? If you're still breathing, still trusting, still showing up in the dark, you're not losing. You're just getting closer to the kind of breakthrough hell can't stop, and heaven already scheduled. Let's wrap this up. The kind of faith that makes hell nervous. Job didn't win because he figured it all out. He won because he didn't fold when everything fell apart. He held the frame when others blamed him. He stayed rooted when silence was louder than answers. He grieved, but didn't quit. He waited, but never got bitter. He lost everything, but he never lost who he was. That kind of faith? It doesn't trend. It doesn't scream. It doesn't need applause. But in the spirit, it terrifies hell. Because when you worship in the dark, when you keep showing up in silence, when you don't curse what you don't understand, you break something. Not just in your life, but in the realm the enemy hoped you'd never touch. So if you're in a storm right now, not just of circumstances, but of silence, confusion, and delay, you're not forgotten. You're being watched. And maybe, just maybe, you're being trusted. With a test, hell was convinced you'd fail. But look at you, still standing, still breathing, still saying, "Blessed be the name of the Lord." That is what spiritual dominance looks like. It's not the absence of struggle. It's refusing to surrender when surrender would be easier. And that's why your story's not over. That's why the reversal is already written. Even if you can't see the next chapter. If something in this message lit a fire in you, don't let it go dim. Watch the next video on how Jesus endured the silence of the cross and how that silence shattered hell's grip forever. Because Job taught us how to survive the silence. But Jesus, he turned it into a weapon. Click next. And whatever you do, don't lose your posture.